Welcome to the Friends of the Library Speaker Series. I'm Roy Scarborough. I'm this year's president of the Friends of the Library. And if you're not already a member of the Friends of the Hannon Library, please consider being one. A little bit about our featured speaker today. Earl moved to Ashland in 1974 and worked about 30 years as an emergency room physician. And somehow, and he'll tell you about it, he got the Shakespeare bug. And over the years, he's published scholarly articles, given presentations, and has dug deep into the subject. In 2004, he began his own scholarly research here at the Hannon Library, at our amazing Bailey collection, which has 10,000 volumes in it. And we're really fortunate to have it. And we're really fortunate to have Earl here to tell us what he has discovered about Shakespeare's authorship and a few other things. Now, we're just finished some of the election season, but we're not going to get into politics again, because there's nothing more political than Shakespeare's authorship. It's a controversy, and Earl has stepped in it. And he's going to step in it again, and he's going to step up here and tell you about it. And please welcome Dr. Earl Showerman.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you at home who are watching and listening in. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. And truly, what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight on all the text and all the hundreds of slides I'm going to show you in the Death by PowerPoint presentation I have planned for you is from quotes from material I got out of the Bailey collection here during years of study here, and almost 2 decades worth. That trouble began in 2003 when I retired from a career in emergency medicine and registered and became a student here. I studied with Alan Armstrong, Elizabeth Eckhart. Liz was fabulous. She's the one that really launched me. And Casey Mohammed. So 2 years, I took a series of classes here and then realized that I could actually jump into this myself because I actually got the first paper I wrote published. It was written for Liz about Hamlet. It turned out to be 50 pages, single space. That was the term paper I wrote because I was so on fire and so excited by what I was finding. Not that it was original in any way, but it was a rediscovery of neglected scholarship that was almost a century. Nothing was being said about the Greek sources of Shakespeare, which was what was driving me. And the reason I love this subject and why I'm really here is because in 1974, I moved here and I met Judd Hyatt, who was the pharmacist at Providence, who was the head of the Redcoat Volunteers in the Elizabethan Theater, who immediately recruited me. And I started going to the plays and I was just blown away by what I saw. The Winter's Tale with Jim Edmondson and Cloche Duron, Two Gentlemen Verona with Dennis Arndt and Mark Murphy. These were things that just made me realize what a brilliant opportunity it is to experience really the essence of religious experience from time to time in that theater. I mean, the statue scene in the Winter's Tale, which I will talk a bit about, just astonished me. And the whole audience was really lit up and sobbing because of the revelation and the redemptive moment of pure religious self-realization. So I realized this is really a very important place to be. And fortunately, with the library we organized some medical conferences here. So we go to the plays after having medical content in the morning. And that encouraged me to write to Angus Bomer and ask him if he would come along and be part of our crew. And he did. He came and gave talks at our little conference that we would have here over years. And so he would bring along Todd Barton and bring along Peggy Rubin and Rex Raybould and any number of actors that he would bring as his guest, and they would perform and eat and drink with us. And it was always a celebration. So like family, truly. And so this is kind of what drove me until the mid-1980s, just pure love of Shakespeare. But in the mid-1980s, I saw a review of a book by Charlton Ogburn called The Mysterious William Shakespeare. It's an 800-page tome that changed the world of Shakespeare studies and the authorship question. It was put into a frontline program called The Shakespeare Mystery, directed by Al Austin, and it was the most popular frontline program in all of frontline history, and they rebroadcast it 3 or 4 times. You can find that, The Shakespeare Mystery, on YouTube these days. It's a wonderful old video from the mid 1980s, inspired by Charlton Ogden's book, which then caused a real explosion of interest in the subject. I started buying books along the way. Around the turn of the century, I started going to Shakespeare conferences. And in 2002, a year before I retired, I heard a young man named Andrew Worth, who was an undergraduate at Concordia University, give a presentation called Shakespeare's Last Greek, in which he pointed out all the elements of the Greek literature and Greek drama and Greek epic and other things that were Greekish in the plays, which had been ignored by scholars for the better part of the past century. And I realized that is a beautiful opening and a wonderful presentation. The article that came out of that was something that I paid a lot of attention to. And so when I began my studies here, and Liz Eckhart comes in, she says, okay, we're doing Hamlet. And he said, what about that ear poisoning? You know, why does he choose that? You know, if you get any answers for that. I said, well, I had this book that my friend Carol Sue had given me called Shakespeare's The Medical Mind of Shakespeare. And it explained how that ear poisoning was a derivative of a poisoning of the Duke of Urbino by his nephew, a guy named Gonzala, as opposed to Gonzalo, okay? So the actual historical poisoning by rubbing in an ointment on the ear and killing somebody came out of an actual historical event. So I went to Liz's office and I told her this. She said, that's really interesting. Well, the next week, he says, what about those pirates? Why does Shakespeare employ pirates to do the peripety, to turn things around? So Hamlet's now determined to go forward and resolve what's going on and confront his destiny. And so I just had received a newsletter from the Shakespeare Oxford Society, which had a detailed article how the Earl of Oxford was waylaid by pirates crossing the channel, and that letters had gone back and forth about complaining about that he was stripped naked. That naked word came up in 3 or 4 historical documents describing the crisis that this nobleman from England had been waylaid by Dutch pirates and the compensations and all that had required for their abuse of the Earl. Well, in Hamlet, the word naked came up about 5 or 6 times in that scene in which Hamlet describes to Horatio his experience of the pirates. So the tie-in personally to the Earl of Oxford and all that. So I knew I was outed. If I went to the office with this, she would know that I was an Oxfordian. I had concealed that during Professor Armstrong's class. He wouldn't want to know about that. And I kept it very quiet until the very last day and handed a little note saying, I think it's worth talking about that. No, he didn't want to talk about that. Anyway, but Liz said, that's very interesting. I said, well, I confess I'm an Oxfordian. He said, fantastic. So she gave me a green light to go ahead and do something that was original. That was not entirely original because I was looking into work that was in Hannon Library that was 100 years old or older that became my food for the next decade as I was evolving my understanding of a variety of Shakespeare's plays and the Greek sources within them. So that's going to be okay, so I go like that. Whoops. I'm not advancing these slides yet. There it goes. So emergency medicine is show business for the unfortunate. That's a quote from Greg Henry, a former colleague, an emergency doc. And the reason I bring that up is because emergency medicine is the most authentically dramatic career that you can have. You have scripted and improvisational things. You have an audience you have to read. You give 120,000, 150,000 performances in your lifetime to a variety of different people. Got to read your audience, break a leg, timing's everything, all these aphorisms, work in a pit. And the difference, the thing that really struck me is a parallel idea about show business and emergency medicine. Well, of course, we had costumes and props like, stethoscopes and scrubs and all that. Anyway, was the fact that we are obliged to develop an eminence-based decision-making as opposed to evidence-based versus eminence-based. That is to say, thank you for coming. That decision-making cannot be based on what was written 50 years ago or 20 years or even 10 years ago. You had to stay up in the literature. Things were changing. CT technology was evolving. All sorts of things were changing. The whole idea of imaging and what laboratory data meant and all that changed. So you had to stay abreast of literature, and you developed a certain skepticism of your own judgment because after all, it's not perfect, your decision making, and so you have to accept the fact that occasionally things have to be reevaluated and you think things through. So you become more skeptical of narratives, of your own narratives and of those who come around you.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. We good? Okay.
Yeah, and you.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that. Okay, great. So let's go on to the questions that I want to raise based on my understandings that came out of research here in the Bailey collection, which again, 10,000 volumes now is phenomenal. And of course, the folio editions and the special collection editions are phenomenal. They're just historical 15th and 16th and 17th century folio editions is gorgeous. And you have an idea of what books were really like back then, incredibly valuable. Anyway, my primary interest initially was looking into the Greek sources in Shakespeare. Were there evidence of drama being affected, Shakespeare's drama being influenced by Greek drama? What's the question? What's the answer to that question? The other question I'm going to be drilling down on a little bit tonight is about the medical knowledge. How knowledgeable was Shakespeare in terms of his medical content? We always hear about his legal content, other specialties. What about medicine? Is that one of his particular interests? And then the last one I'm going to really kind of talk about a little bit was what kind of poetic license did Shakespeare have? Was he highly, satiric in terms of his treatment of members of the court, particularly Queen Elizabeth? And I'm going to give you a very brief argument about Midsummer Night's Dream and how there's excellent argument that that was a wonderful satire about the Queen's romance with the Duke of Alençon, represented by Bottom and Titania. Anyway, so we'll start with the actual first dedicatory epistle of Shakespeare's first folio, published in 1623, now almost 400 years ago. In Ben Jonson's words, he says, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek, from thence to honor thee, I would not seek for names, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles to us, to hear thy buskin tread and to shake a stage. He is not of an age, but for all time." So small Latin and less Greek. And that seems to be the general conclusion in terms of the untranslated sources. What were Shakespeare's Greek sources that we know were translated? How important were they in him? Most important one being Plutarch's Lives. It has the plots for all the Roman tragedies, Antony Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, and Timon of Athens is affected by that. So the Roman tragedies were profoundly influenced by Plutarch, and his names of his characters within the entire parallel lives was incorporated in a number of the plays. So he used Plutarchian nomenclature all through his canon. There was a French translation that was then translated into English by North in the late 1580s. So that was probably his first use of Plutarch. Was very valuable. It's a 1,000-page book. There was no inventory of books in his collection at the end, but we know he must have had Plutarch. Heliodorus' Ethiopica is the source of many of the romances that were written during that time, including Shakespeare's romances such as Pericles, Winter's Tale, August. They were influenced by the Ethiopica, and it was translated by Thomas Underdown in 1569 and dedicated to the Earl of Oxford, of all people. There was a Lucian translation that was about a century old, a Latin translation by Erasmus and Sir Thomas More, which is the source for Timon the Misanthrope. And so it's definitely a source for Timon. And Homer's Iliad was probably influential. George Chapman's translation in Troilus and Cressida, certainly. There were untranslated books, however, toward the book 22, 23, 24, that were not yet translated at the time that Troilus and Cressida was first published. So that does raise certain questions. Herodotus' histories probably influenced Titus Andronicus. And we know that the Corpus Hermeticum by Hermes Trismegistus probably was influential in the resuscitation scenes in both Pericles and in the statue scene of the Winter's Tale. Many scholars have identified that. That would have been a Latin translation by Ficino, published in the 15th century in Italy. Pieces of that came into England in various forms. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, again in Timon of Athens, Greek anthology, clearly influenced sonnets 150 through 154. So these are mostly sources that have had English translations or Latin translations that would have been accessible to many in England. However, the question is about the Greek drama. Was Shakespeare influenced by Greek drama? Now we're going to go back a century to Robert Root, who wrote this as a PhD thesis at Yale and became a Chaucer specialist and the dean at Princeton, highly respected scholar. But he says this, and I completely disagree with him. It is certain that he nowhere alludes to any characters or episodes of Greek drama, that they extended no influence whatsoever in his conception of mythology. Now, this is becomes boilerplate. 50 years later, in J.A.K. Thompson's Shakespeare in the Classics, a well-known book right here in the library, Shakespeare was not a scholar. Greek was out of the question. And then another couple decades later, in Shakespeare, in Uses of Classical Antiquity by the Martindales, they assert that any Greek language Shakespeare had would not have been sufficient to allow him to read the extremely taxing poetry of the 5th century BC. Moreover, Despite all efforts, no one has succeeded in producing one single piece of evidence. Again, this is overstatement, hyperbolic, from the plays that make any such debt certain or even particularly likely. So they're really dismissive. Again, 2004, another collection, Shakespeare in the Classics, editor Michael Silk says there's no reason to suppose Shakespeare was ever encountered any of the Greek tragedians, either in the original or in Latin or other translations. And finally, A.D. Nuttall, the writer of Shakespeare, the thinker, a brilliant man in most regards. And, you know, I have used his work in my analysis of Timon. He was brilliant. But he says this, that Shakespeare was cut off in Greek poetry and drama is probably a bleak truth we should accept, you know. And he said the occasional echoes, but really compared to how he uses Ovid, you know, this is almost nothing. That's his implication. Finally, the most recent publication is by Colin Burrow, who is a professor at Oxford University and a highly respected classicist who's written books on this subject, says Shakespeare almost certainly never read Sophocles or Euripides, let alone much more difficult Aeschylus in Greek, and yet he managed to write tragedies which invite comparison with those authors. He read Plutarch in Norse translation rather than reading Sophocles in Greek. Now, here's what he says. Having less Greek could therefore have enabled him to appear to understand more about the Greek tragedy and its complex mingling of voluntary actions with divine promptings, and than he would have done had he actually been able to work his way through Aeschylus and Euripides. And that was written less than a decade ago. So the consensus for over a decade, a century, I'm telling you here, is that no Greek. Okay. Why? Well, T.W. Baldwin wrote this fabulous book, it's in the archives here, about Shakespeare's education and about, you know, the literature of that era. He said, well, Shakespeare appears to have read no Greek in the plays themselves, and these books were not existent in most of the grammar schools. There were a handful of grammar schools that did have Greek texts and Greek education and Greek scholarships to the universities, but only 3 or 4 in the entire country. There were only 2 Greek translations of 2 English translations, of Greek tragedies, which was Euripides, Iphigenia at Aulis, and Jocasta, which is based on a Sophocles play. The influence of Senecan tragedy is also thought to be a mediator. Ovid's Metamorphoses thought to be a bit of a mediator. Why? And the other most recent argument is that these are from co-authored inputs, that he co-authored Titus Andronicus with George Peele, and George Peele did translate the Greek. So all the Greek elements that are in Titus Andronicus, we can attribute that to Peele, and Peele taught Shakespeare what he needed to know. We have no relationship between those 2 authors. The OUP is based on a methodology that is about word adjacency studies and computer driven, and they postulate that there were 11 different contributors to 17 different plays. That's how extreme they are in deconstructing Shakespeare using computer modeling. That doesn't account for the fact that there may be mimicking of one, writer from another writer. There may be evolution in the style. There may be, these kinds of things they don't account for. So they've really gone out on a limb, and that helps them explain how Shakespeare has his Greek. Then there's the authorship challenge, which makes people pull back because people like De Vere or Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, they were fluent with Greek, or they had some exposure certainly to Greek. We can't say they were fluent, but at least they were educated with Greek texts. Now, the university wits all had Greek. Look at these guys: Lilly, Peele, Green, Marlowe, Lodge, Johnson, Chapman, Nash. All these guys had experience of either reading Greek, had Greek text, or did a Greek translation, were known to understand. But Shakespeare, no, isn't that just drive you crazy? Because Shakespeare does have that. Now, this is the one scene that I think that I want to show you. Thank you for staying with me so far. In that, this is Elizabeth Farren, who's an actress on Drury Lane, 1780, performing the role of Hermione in the statue scene. She's leaning on a pedestal. If you look at the pedestal, you can see 2 graven images, a light one above and a dark one below. Those graven images, the dramaturg or whoever designed this play put scenes from Euripides' Alcestis. The rescue of Alcestis at the end of Euripides' play was thought to be the source for this scene, the Winter's Tale, the most beautiful statue scene imaginable. So the upper panel shows Hercules taking her away from death, and the very bottom and the lower panel, and this is at her tomb, he's wrestling with death, with Hades, to prevent him from taking her to the underworld. He succeeds, brings her back, she's veiled, and then her husband is forced to take her hand, then she's unveiled and revealed to be his wife, that restored to life. And it's a miraculous It's from the tragic comedy. It's the only tragic comedy of the Greek canon that we have. The only satyr play that we have. They were called satyr plays, but this would be called a tragic comedy, where you start with a very tragical beginning, where she's dying in the household, and there's a great grieving going on, and then she's taken off to the tomb, and then Hercules shows up, and he starts having a drunken party because they don't want to tell him that the queen just died. And then he becomes totally embarrassed by the situation when he realized what a fool he's made of himself, strutting around and calling out how great the goddess of love is and all that. It's a hysterical scenes of him vamping around, just like Bottom. And so he goes off to the tomb, rescues her from the death, and brings her back. She's veiled, and the king has to take her. He doesn't want to. He says, "I swear I'll never be with another woman," you know. And so Hercules forces the hand, and it turns out it's Alcestis. She's returned to life. So it's a miracle scene, just like the end of The Winter's Tale. And what Wilson Knight calls this, it was the most strikingly conceived and profoundly penetrating moment in English literature. And in 1780, the theater company knew that was based on Euripides' Alcestis. The similarities of those two scenes are so remarkable that they could not be avoided. And that yet it was ignored. There was no comment on it in almost the entire 20th century of literature. For a whole century, nobody even acknowledged that. And yet, when you go back to the Variorum editions that are 100-year-old editions that have magnificent citations that go on for hundreds of pages, and look at these footnotes. Footnotes that cover up 3/4 of the page. This is what you have to have when you want to study Shakespeare in depth and understand. And then they have foreign criticism and criticism for the 17th and 18th centuries in these books. That's what the scholars were. They understood in Greek and Latin. They were familiar with the classics in ways that many Shakespeare scholars today are not. So Lord Campbell was a Lord Chancellor. In his book, The Legal Acquirements of Shakespeare, he comments on the fact that Macbeth is so much like the Prometheus and the Furies of the Attic stage that he breathes the same air that Aeschylus does in his great tragedies. You know, that they have a similarity, that he thinks that Shakespeare must have been a studious Greek scholar, even though he knew he wasn't. And he's writing about his legal knowledge, and remarkably, another author writes a book about Shakespeare's medical knowledge in response to Campbell's legal acquirements book. So it's very, very interesting tit for tat between doctors and lawyers. Anyway, Churton Collins at the turn of the century was a very highly respected Cambridge Don. And he thought that Shakespeare clearly used the Latin translations and they were extant on the continent. They had been published in Paris and in Venice and other centers, publication centers in Europe, but they just were only in the occasional private libraries in Great Britain, like William Cecil's library, Thomas Smith's library. You would have inventories of those libraries that had many of these Greek editions were there. Of the Latin translations, parallel Greek and Latin translations, which were very, very common and very popular on the continent, but not in England yet. But Gilbert Murray, the man who changed my life when I went in and I entered Orestes and Hamlet when I was beginning my studies on this play, and it popped up this pamphlet that Gilbert Murray, the foremost Greek scholar in England in the early 20th century, a great citizen, co-founder of Oxfam. He was a representative of the United Nations. He was a citizen larger than life. He reinvented the Euripidean stage in London and was greatly honored. But he saw the parallels between Hamlet and Orestes in ways that no one has ever said anything deeper about it since then. He really covered the board. But it was 1914, and it was the beginning. A month later, World War I began, and his work was mostly ignored thereafter. Jan Kot, a great scholar from Poland, noted that a great deal has been written about Hamlet's connection to ancient tragedy. It is significant that the subject has been treated least by Shakespeare scholars, that historians see it, that Greek scholars see it, others might see it, but the Shakespeare scholars totally ignore it. As far as they're concerned, it's off the books. You can't go look at that. But Wilson Knight says the step from Aeschylus to Shakespeare is very easy because he says they breathe the same air of questioning adventure and study the brooding sense of blood and death as vast antagonists of the soul of man. Sorry, the slides are a little messed up for you guys. Anyway, finally, 1990, a great scholar from Washington State University, Louis Schleiner, publishes in the Shakespeare Quarterly a definitive study of the fact that Shakespeare must have been familiar with the Latinized Latin translation of the Oresteia in order to have written it. She said that the parallels in the scene with Horatio and Pylades, the parallels being with their friends near a tomb at the very end when the sister comes forward, and there's parallels that are just remarkable at that scene. It's far more likely that Hamlet is in an Orestian character rather than a edible one. He's far more likely to kill his mother than he is to want to be her lover. So I'm going to skip a little bit farther forward. The one person who really in the last century has really broke out of it is a professor at SUNY Brooklyn named Tanya Pollard. She was a Rhodes Scholar, so she was a very bright gal, went to London, to Oxford and studied there. This book, Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages, opens up the gallery to the consideration of Shakespeare as being very familiar with certainly Euripides. These are the plays that she analyzes, and she actually cited my work, several of my articles in that book there, and it won an award. So, and I've been in correspondence with her since then. So it continues to be an interest to me. And so I just want to show you that the number of plays that I've studied based on material right out of the Hannon Library here, the Bailey Collection, includes Hamlet, that they had the Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus's Orestes dramas are likely to have influenced that. Macbeth, well, I was studying in an Ollie class, and we're reading the Oresteia, a 10-week class of reading that trilogy. At the same time, OSF was producing Macbeth, which was a chilling classical production. Oh my God, Robin Rodriguez as one of the witches, and it was the Robin Goodwin Nordley as Lady Macbeth. It was a fabulous, chilling production. And when the other classmates and I came to our next class, I said, "Did you see Macbeth? Did you see all the parallels?" I wrote down a dozen parallels that night at home from the deep dive we were doing on that trilogy, reading several translations for comparison's sake, and realizing that Shakespeare was inspired by the same kind of themes. And I wrote a paper about that, and that was eventually published too. The Winter's Tale conclusion with the statue scene in Euripides' Alcestis was pretty well recognized by scholars historically, but Much Ado has a very similar ending. And I wrote a paper about that based on some comments I had in a pub with a friend and said, well, it's Winter's Tale, it's got to be Much Ado too, right? Look at the dramaturgy. Well, I observed two things about that play that was unique. One, I looked at all the Hercules allusions in there, and I looked kind of sideways at the 35 different allusions to Hercules and the nuanced allusions that he has in that play. But I also recognize that the scene in Shakespeare's play at the tomb of Hero, where they do obeisance and proclaim and sing and perform a solemn ceremony at the temple right before the denouement, the discovery of the Don John's villainy and all, is exactly paralleled in Euripides' Alcestis. There's a description of the chorus singing at the tomb and the things that affect the tomb, almost identical to that. It was my great privilege to participate in the program last year with Mark Rylance. And I wrote the script for Mark about comparing these two passages when I was talking about the Greek influences on this play. And to hear Mark Rylance recite these things is a thrill. It's still available online. If you email me, earlys@charter.net, I'll send you the link so you can see. I could prove that I worked with Mark on this because he is an authorship doubter, and his community in England are friends of mine. Anyway, so I really want to get into a few other things before we do, because I don't know how much time I've got left. I'm just going to keep going here. Oh, good. We're less than half an hour in. So the question of medical knowledge came up. I was invited to give a talk at an emergency physician meeting down in Yosemite Park 10 years ago. This was Ron Crowell lives in Ashland. He's an ER doc who's a friend of mine, and he got us together. And he said, "You sitting with Shakespeare, Earl?" He says, "Well, why don't you come on down and you be one of our evening, talkers about Shakespeare? What do you think about that?" I said, "Well, that sounds good, Ron. I don't know what I talk to ER docs about Shakespeare, but well, maybe medical knowledge would be worthwhile." Okay, yeah, let's go there. So I began doing some reading. I have one book, This Medical Mind of Shakespeare. I think that's it. I got what I need. Okay, that come into the Bailey collection. I look, oh my God. Oh, it's going and going. There's 7, 8, 9, 10 books in there, different aspects of Shakespeare's medical knowledge. And subsequently, there was a 400-page dictionary of Shakespeare's medical terms that was published a few years later. So there was a great interest in this. And some of those titles were contemporaneous, but the original one was 1860. And John Bucknell was a physician, a psychiatrist in Essex, and he wrote his book in response to Lord Campbell's book about Shakespeare's legal requirement, kind of doctor, lawyer, comparative. Our guy's cooler than yours. He's probably a doctor. Well, he's a lawyer, whatever. So that became a basis upon which I could build a broader argument and review commentaries on Shakespeare's medical knowledge, and realize that it's quite remarkable. And for the first time in my entire life, I was actually interested in medical history. Yeah. So Oh, no, in Dr. Bucknell's original book, and he published one also, the Mad Folk in Shakespeare. Excellent, excellent. He was a real humanist, Dr. Bucknell, really a popular person in Essex. I mean, yeah, in Exeter, where he lived and where this big psychiatric hospital was. I actually talked to the staff there one day when I was visiting in England, and they told me about his reputation. He said it would be difficult to point to any great author, not himself a physician, in whose works the healing art is referred to more frequently, more respectfully than in those of Shakespeare. Most of the plays written about that time, if they have a doctor and it's a quack, okay? Almost all of them are treated absolutely satirically during that time. Johnson in particular goes after that, but most of the other plays, because doctors were quacks. They were using a completely erroneous model of Galenic medicine. Oh my God, how they ever figured out anything that was going on, I can't imagine. Dr. Simpson, writing 100 years later, okay, we're talking 100 years jump now. The next book on this is really good. It's a Scottish physician, Dr. R.R. Simpson. Where did Shakespeare obtain all this medical knowledge? Well, it wasn't from John Hall, his son-in-law. His son-in-law married his Shakespeare's Susanna back in about 1605, okay? After almost all those plays that have medical content are presumed to have been written, okay? So he comes to Stratford, he's around for a while, he marries a daughter, they live in the same house for 10 years, and never once does Dr. Hall make a mention of his famous father-in-law, the playwright, or indicate that he ever had a medical discussion with him, despite Shakespeare's rather awesome medical knowledge. So where did he get it? A considerable amount shows not only an astute knowledge of medical affairs, but also keen sense of the correct use of that knowledge, that he knew how to express himself in ways that physicians are trained to, like lawyers are trained to. Briefly, we can accept this, that Shakespeare was well acquainted with the medical knowledge of his day and probably also with his literature. And he continues, no aspect of the study of Shakespeare shows more clearly his inspired poetic eye and mind. And I think this is probably kind of true. I'll give you one passage. Then the clinical descriptions he found in his writings, the accuracy of observation, his apt use of words, and that he leaves in the mind of his audience or his reader are not only unsurpassed, they are not even approached in clinical value by any medical writings, however erudite. Now, I don't know that I would go to a playwright for medical information and knowledge, but maybe. Anyway, Aubrey Cale says in his book that I have here, which was published originally in 1986, that his plays bear witness to profound knowledge of contemporary physiology, particularly Galenic physiology, and Falstaff is the real promoter of Galenic physiology, psychology, medical terms of manner, which have been beyond the powers of an ordinary playwright who was not trained as a physician. Continuing, he exhibited the feelings associated with the tragedy, sufferings and influence of sympathy upon the patient, the relationship between hope and prognosis, the value of mirth, the evils of alcohol, the pangs of insomnia. This is a man who's inspired. In his writing here about Shakespeare, I mean, he just goes on and on. He's beautifully describing, the benefits of sleep and finally the attributes of death. It's just a beautiful sentence. I don't know. Shakespeare inspires doctors to write better, I guess. That's what Aristophanes said, that playwrights are there to make society better. So Shakespeare makes us all better. Anyway, there's about 700 identifiable medical references in the canon spread over about 35 plays. That's about 20 references a play. That's a lot of medical content to be including in that. So he shows knowledge of anatomy, specifically Galenic physiology. There's surgical commentaries. There's a whole book on Shakespeare's obstetrics, public health in terms of plague and these things, aging, and dementia. He's got that going. Forensics, he describes beautifully like a CSI, the strangulation in Henry VI Part 2 of one of the characters in the play, and describes the face and the hands and the struggle. He gives you a whole physiologic reason why this person died of strangulation. It's beautiful. I mean, in terms of the accuracy of it. All right, and infectious diseases, and particularly syphilis. I mean, the French pox or the Gallicus, French spot, whatever it was coming through England, and it was going through Spain. Of course, the English call it the French pox, the French call it the Spanish pox, the Spanish call it the appellate disease. Nobody wanted responsibility for originating syphilis, but it was around, and people got sick from it, and there were mercury cures for it, and people would die from it, and they would have deformities and all this. But specifically in Troilus and Cressida and in Timon of Athens, there's incredible descriptions of the anatomic changes that are associated with tertiary syphilis, because you get these big joints and the nose fails and you get rashes, and precise descriptions of these things, particularly in the satiric problem plays like Timon and Troilus. He knew about the conflict between Galen and the new coming experimental process promoted by Paracelsus. And there's one passage I'm going to show you how he's done that. And then, of course, there's the favorable characterizations of physicians generally. Dr. Pinch in one play, and there's another Dr. Butt, another play I think is not treated very well. Anyway, Carolyn Spurgeon, writing about Shakespeare's imagery, says it's his sensitive understanding of the influence of the mind on body, so psychophysiological things, is what, however, puts him nearest modern expert opinion. And that was confirmed, her opinion, her analysis, confirmed by a series of articles by this Dr. Kenneth Heaton, published in England and the British Medical Journal and this Medical Humanities, which is affiliated with that. But he shows how he was exceptional in his use of sensory disturbances, hyperventilation, syncope, fainting, tachycardia, all sorts of chill feelings or these kinds of things, or sudden death. He portrays probably 20 episodes of sudden death on or off the stage. So he's showing the, whole bunch of very interesting things that relate to psychophysiological phenomena, the emotional stress that causes people to die. He identifies it. And of course, he's an expert on mental illness. Everybody's written about this, about his depressed Jacques and Antonio and Merchant of Venice, the number of suicides that he portrays, epilepsy, seizures, and Caesar, Ed and Othello are described. We have all the mad characters. I don't even mention Mad Tom, but he was feigning it, of course, or Hamlet. Hallucinations, Macbeth certainly, what is this, a dagger that I see before me? And then, of course, the consequence of alcoholism that you see at Falstaff in particular, and Toby Belch, very, very well done. And perfectly played, of course. And of course, you have the issue of dementia. I think King Lear can be played as a slightly demented person is kind of losing it. And Ken Albers did it on the outdoor stage here one time. And I think that Shylock can also be interpreted. His language is the kind of language that you find in people that are having frontotemporal dementia and loss of social connection. So who are his doctors? Well, numero uno is Lord Cerimon and Pericles. I hope some of you got to see the Pericles production here that was here in 2015 in the Thomas Theater. It was a knockout show. It was just an incredible, beautiful romance. It's as good as they get. They actually left out the most important speech in it, but still, I love the show. It went on to play at the Folger, actually. The other really important physician is Helena in All's Well, who cures the king's fistula with an ointment that she received from her father. And in a matter of days, with her physicians couldn't cure. And she is the perfect Paracelsian empiric practitioner. It turns out the Earl of Oxford's mother-in-law and wife are both empiric medical practitioners. There's documentary evidence that noble women got involved in becoming educated about medical consequences and herbology and all these things and read medical books and treated the people in their neighborhood. So there's well-established relationships that physicians who were trained at Cambridge and Oxford, they would be practicing in the old Galenic thing. The barber surgeons were the ones that were really making the advances. The doctors were still stuck on an old model that was no longer valuable. Cornelius and Cymbeline saves the day by substituting a poison for simply a sedative in an attempt to poison Imogen. And then there's the unnamed physicians in Lear and Macbeth that both offer some solace and recognition of what's going on. And Friar Lawrence, of course, he was mixing herbs out in his garden, so he's really technically a physician. He was an anesthesiologist. He could put him out for hours and then bring him back. All right, so there's the kinds of doctors. Now I just want to show one short passage about Cerimon oh my gosh, we had time warp here. I'm so happy. Thank you for listening. So the resuscitation scene in Pericles is perhaps the most divinely inspired scene besides the Winter Tale, maybe the resuscitation of Hermione and bringing her back of life. But the story comes, there's this big storm and the buildings shake and this giant billow blows up this beautiful cocked, treasure chest onto the beach. It's a tsunami. There was an earthquake. And then Shakespeare actually describes a tsunami. He says, the largest billow you could imagine, and here's this chest gets tossed up on the shore, dumped out at sea, presuming that she was dead. Pericles and the crew said she's gone. She delivered a baby. She died postpartum. And they caulked this thing and they put all the jewels and notes and everything, and they're telling who she is and shipped her out because it would be bad luck to have a dead body on a boat. And it was a big storm and the boat was about to go down, so they had to toss her body out. And that was required. And of course, Pericles didn't want to do it, but he was forced to do this. So she arrives and they open the chest and they see her and they say, oh my God, bring her in, bring her here. Let's see what Lord Shakespeare can do. So they bring her up onto the shore. And he says this, he says, well, he's starting to do his little ritual. He says, well, he actually does. He swears by Apollo and Asclepius to give him the power to bring her back. He says, bring us heat. Of course, she's hypothermic, and play this divine music. So he has this music playing. People are putting hot coals around her and getting her rewarmed. And she comes back. And she sits up and she's restored completely. It's a miracle. It's a story. It's a fairy tale. Okay. And they ask her, how did you do this? What was your key to being able to do this? He says, well, death may usurp on nature many hours, and yet the fire of life kindle again the o'erpressed spirit. Heard of an Egyptian that had 9 hours laid dead, who was by good appliance recovered. Who is the Egyptian? The Egyptian is that guy Hermes Trismegistus, who is the alleged author of the Corpus Hermeticum, which was written probably in the 2nd century AD, but was thought to have been written 1,000 years earlier when it arrived in Italy. It was misdated by 1,000 years. It took Isaac Casaubon in the early 17th century to figure out that this is a phony thing. It was not written back 800 years BC. It was thought to be contemporaneous with Moses and the Hebrews, and this divine knowledge was brought forward in this collection of Hermetic texts that have magic and philosophy, Gnosticism, astrology, alchemy. And in their one passage from the Asclepius, another chapter from that corpus, the resuscitation of bringing back to life statues that had been magically influenced. It was translated by Ficino, thought to be incredibly influential during the 15th century in Italy. And here is the Siena Cathedral that shows Moses on your left there with the tablets. And then there's Hermes with a taller hat with his book, the Corpus Hermeticum. He was thought to be equal to Moses in his knowledge and the authenticity of his religious, capacities, of his knowledge of what he was willing to share. So the Asclepius, which is part of the Corpus Hermeticum, describes in detail the reanimation of statues to the accompaniment of music. And so Francis Yates says, oh, let's rest content on the high probability that Shakespeare knew the God-making passages from the Asclepius, and both as regards to the Winter's Tale and Timon of Athens. And here's what Showerman says before that occurs. He's asked about how did he become knowledgeable and so respected in his craft. And he says this here, and this is beautiful. This is the only Shakespeare quote I think I got the whole passage here. I hold it ever, virtue and cunning were endowments greater than nobleness and riches. Perilous airs may the two latter darken and expend, but immortality attends the former, making the man a god. 'Tis known, I ever have studied physic, through which secret art, by turning o'er authorities, I have, together with my practice, made familiar to me and to my aid the blessed infusions that dwell in vegetatives, in metals, stones, and can speak of the disturbances of nature that nature works, and of her cures, which doth give me a more content in course of true delight than to be thirsty after tottering honor or tie my pleasure up in silken bags to please the fool and death. There's an amazing medical ethical expression of his knowledge that came from the book, from his studies of nature itself, and that he has this special. Now, this was a passage that would have appealed to many in the 16th century. They felt that there's certain characters were infused with a divine inspiration and knowledge and capacity that was not thought to be unusual. So Showerman's expression here seems quite authentic, and it's not selling snake oil. And Aubrey Kell says it's his greatest tribute to the medical profession, stated by Showerman, and even more so in one of the wonderful books here. David Henniger says there is no other speech like this devoted to medical art and the whole range of Elizabethan, Jacobean, or Caroline drama. Showerman exemplifies the Hippocratic ideal in medicine. So Shakespeare has done an amazing thing in terms of bringing together all these various threads of medical content and integrated them over and over again into the wide spectrum of his plays. So clearly had access to some kind of medical library. He must have had access to perhaps the Corpus Hippocraticum. There's several Hippocratic aphorisms that are referred to in there, plus the whole philosophy. The Hermeticum. The Castle of Health is likely to be a source for much of the Galenic ideas that he expresses. Holofernes refers to the third ventricle of memory fed by the pia mater. Now, who knows how many ventricles are in the brain, okay? there's four ventricles. The third ventricle must be somewhere near the memory core. And oh yeah, there's a pia mater that lines the third ventricle. He knew this. He put this, slipped it into a whole Fairney's just speech about this. This pen is talking about things. He knows anatomic details, neuroanatomy. It's unbelievable. Some of the best work on Shakespeare's medical knowledge is by neurologists. They are really tuned in to this. In fact, a neurosurgeon and two neurologists are sort of my inspirations for much of the content that I share with you guys about this one. The treatise of melancholy for his depressed patients. A variety of other sources were likely to be William Cloy's Morbus Gallicus. This is this book on syphilis and its manifestations. And so in the Paracelsus passage that Lord Cerimon and Helena both have probably came from early translations of Paracelsus by John Hester. And one of those translations, incidentally, was dedicated to the Earl of Oxford. All right. So I got about 50 more minutes here, and I'm going to just try to knock your socks off one last time. What about Shakespeare's poetic license? Could he mock members of the court? Who got away with that? Nobody. Marlowe, said some things that were slightly subversive. He was an atheist, had homosexual implications, would die from the eye. Thomas Kidd, brought in, tortured, gone a year later. Thomas Nash, all his books burned. Chapman, Johnson in jail repeatedly, tortured. The Isle of Dogs gone. Shut down theaters. There was a tyrannical attempt to control the content of anything that went out. And any insult to the Queen could get your hand cut off. Okay? You did have a John Stubbs name that wrote a pamphlet that insulted the Queen, who was at that time engaged in negotiations with the French for the marriage of the Duke of Alençon, which is the fundamental thing we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. And he lost his hand, and so did his printer, But he said, God save the Queen, I love the Queen, even though he's getting his hand cut off. So they did not take lightly anything that referred to the Queen in any kind of a subversive way. Now, she could be allegorized in a pageant. Yes, she expected that. She could be there. There could be a some kind of formal presentation in which she was honored in some way. And she recognized that she was the most clever interpreter of the allegorical content. There was one in which Juno was debating Artemis, and Juno wins. And she says, it's all against me, because she was affiliated with Artemis Diana, and Juno was supposed to get married and have babies. Okay. She tells the French ambassador, this is against me, because the implication of the playwright is to say, you should get married and have kids and deal with the succession thing before you get too old, But she didn't. Of course, she didn't. Now, what about Midsummer Night's Dream? Let's talk about that. I think that this play is a lot like Aristophanes' plays. And if you study Aristophanes, and there's a lot of books about Aristophanes here, I really enjoyed reading them, because he had more poetic license than even our contemporary late night hosts. He was out of control. He was out there. They would do all sorts of things that were designed to embarrass powerful people like Pericles and Socrates and Cleon. The tyrants in Greece during the Athenian democracy were mocked on the comic stage. You couldn't do an insult in the tragedies, but the comedies was wide open. And Cleon sued Aristophanes and lost in court, because they stood up for Aristophanes, saying whatever the heck you want. He would have people on the front of the stage saying, Cleon's terrible, he's a tyrant, and it would be in the middle of a play about something else, and it was like they could get away with it. But Aristophanes was that way. And he had Shakespeare had some similarities. So I just wrote a paper about this. It's on the list. All of the citations in the handout I gave you are available free online on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. I think I don't have the URL there, but I'll give it to you at the very end here. And you can check out any of the things that I say and see if you agree or not. Anyway, Aristophanes and Shakespeare appear to have some similarities as far as native talent goes. So 100 years ago, they're recognizing that Aristophanes and Shakespeare had some similarities. And in C.L. Barber's wonderful book on Shakespeare's festive comedy, he says that Shakespeare is more Aristophatic than any other great Shakespeare comic dramatist, despite the fact that the accepted educated models for comedy were Terentian and Plautine, that the Latin comedies, the new comedy by the Latins. See, Aristophanes was writing old comedy, which meant political comedy. New comedy, it's all about love affairs and fathers who don't want their daughters running off and so and so. It's all romantic, comic light stuff. Aristophanes was writing heavy stuff about the real problems that Athens had during that time. He would be more like a contemporary satirist today. How are they similar? Well, they are both very self-consciously literate. They load their plays up with all these classical allusions and references that are both topical, but also classical allusions. Shakespeare loads his plays up with both Greek and Latin classical allusions, plus medieval things and all this. So they both have burlesque braggers. You think of Bottom, of course, or Toby Belcher, or some of the other characters that just, really raise hell and go out there. Aristophanes has characters that are very much like that. And cross-dressing was part of his thing. And the costumes were outrageous. They were the chorus of birds are a bunch of men running around with bird outfits and upright phalluses. You see them on vase paintings. You say, wow. Of course, it was all male audience, and all of them were veterans. So it played to an all veterans audience, thousands, okay? But I'm sure women saw these plays somehow, but they were not usually invited to the show. It was mostly for the citizens, and women were not citizens. And even though in democratic Athens, they have grotesque animal-like characters that go through metamorphoses. Bottom gets a head of an ass, and the birds, the heroes, the Athenians who are in exile from Athens, sprout wings from eating a magical root. Okay, so the parallels that they have metamorphic characters, and particularly the birds and Midsummer Night's Dream, very characteristic. There's magical plants in both of those. Of course, we've got the love potion in Titania's eyes. Both use puns, paranomasia, it's a Greek term, for using punning on words. They would pun on everything. And they would do parodies of tragedies. Think about Dermis and Thisbe. That's a parody of Romeo and Juliet. That's a very Aristophatic kind of thing. He would take a tragedy by Euripides and make a mockery of it, okay? And he'd have a fun time doing it. And he loved the other playwrights. They all got around. They all went to the symposium. Plato's symposium. It's got Aristophanes there. It's got other playwrights, sitting around drinking wine. And then at the very end, Socrates says to everybody, and this is where the Earl of Oxford's listening, because he did have a collection of Plato dialogues. Socrates says, it's okay, you write good comedies, you write good tragedies, but a really great playwright writes both tragedies and comedies. That's his final word of advice at the end of the symposium, one of the great narratives about love from the Platonic canon. Most importantly, they have both read satiric political allegories. And I want to prove to you how Shakespeare does it in Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream is considered to be by many scholars to have been an epithalamium. That is to play a play written for a special noble wedding, whether it was royal or simply, the Earl of Oxford, the Earl of Berkeley, some other nobleman, the Earl of Derby getting married in the mid-1590s. Speculation is for one of those marriages, don't know which one, likely to have been written for that. That seems to be common commentary in most Shakespeare dream editions. And it turns out that this is the play where Queen Elizabeth is clearly alluded to far and beyond any other play. This is the one. This is the passage. Helen Hackett, in her book on Shakespeare and Elizabeth, says, the clearest reference to Queen Elizabeth in Shakespeare's works is in Oberon's Vision and Dream, the subject of more voluminous speculation than any other 25 lines in all of Shakespeare. Talk about controversy. So Shakespeare, Oberon writes, telling Puck, flying between the cold moon and the earth, Cupid, all armed, a certain aim he took at a fair vestal thrown by the west, Elizabeth, okay, and loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow as it should pierce 100,000 hearts. But I might see Cupid's fiery shaft quenched in the chaste beams of the watery moon, and the imperial votress passed on in maiden meditation, fancy free. So no, she didn't get hit by the love arrow, not fallen in love. She's, the imperial votress, okay? Vestal, she's the Vestal. So here's Queen Elizabeth. She has so many fabulous portraits. This is from Hatfield House. I actually saw this portrait doing a tour some years ago. It's stunning, the details on that. But she sees herself allegorically, and her cousin, Sir John Harrington, said she is the best at depicting the allegory in any of these plays or pageants that they put on for her. But can you imagine that she would be pleased that there was a play that was performed and published during her lifetime, 1598 was published, making her look like she was in love with a monster, an ass-headed human being, Bottom, okay? I mean, it would be very hard to believe that. In fact, Jonathan Bate, in his book on Shakespeare and Ovid, says Shakespeare cannot afford to license this interpretation of an image of the queen in a perverse encounter which upsets both the natural and the social order. If such an interpretation were at all prominent, the master of the revels would not have licensed the play. And that's what Jonathan Bate says. Now, Bate is an honorable man and a very knowledgeable man, but apparently he's not read Marion Taylor's book, also available in the Bailey collection here. Bottom, though, a translated political allegory in A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you really want to know the story, my paper is a good paper to read. It's a good start, but then you got to go to Marion Taylor because she nails it. And this was written in 1974, and you do not see one reference to her work in any contemporary edition of Midsummer Night's Dream. It's so subversive, it cannot be tolerated, and yet it's compelling in my view. So I'm going to review a little bit about this. It's about her affair, Queen Elizabeth's affair with the Duc d'Alençon. Born Hercule de Valois, he was petite. When his brother Francis died, they renamed it Francois Hercule de Valois, the Duc d'Alençon, and later he became the Duc d'Anjou. When he was 17 years old, marital negotiations with Elizabeth started up. King Henry II was on the throne. He died. King Henry III came along. He was the youngest brother of the French succession. He was the last remaining young brother. So Henry III is on the throne, and Queen Elizabeth is negotiating this thing for a decade. It goes a decade because St. Bartholomew's massacre came in between. They had to break off the negotiations. But in the late 1570s, 79 and 80, it was hot, back on. Alençon would sneak into England several times secretly without a passport, without the permission of his older brother, who was the King of France, to visit the Queen during these, very quiet and then more public negotiations. But can you imagine the French Duke being allegorized as bottom? And this is Jamie Newcomb, one of our very favorite actors from OSF, in a production of Dream that he performed at Portland Center Stage as bottom. Jamie's an Oxfordian, incidentally. I just want to let you know. So now, Alençon was first proposed to marriage in the 70s. He was a teenager, and the Queen was 18 years older than him. Okay, so it's like she's in her late 30s, early 40s during this time. Last opportunity to really get married and have a kid and guarantee the succession. So it's a serious negotiation. It seems to be, at least. So he wrote love letters ardent enough to set fire to water. They were all encoded. It took years and centuries sometimes to uncode some of the letters that they exchanged. And with his ambassador, Simier, very recently, a letter was then decoded recently that had gone unrecognized for years from the ambassador that came for Alençon. But he would visit her daily in chambers unchaperoned. Okay, so there was a little hottie thing going on between the two of them in the back quarters. According to Martin Hume, one of the great historians of that era, the Queen's passion and vanity were overmastering her judgment, according to him. Okay, so he sent Jean Simier to carry on, to bring in thousands of pounds in wealth and jewels, and the negotiation, the gifting back and forth was really something. Well, this guy, Simier, was the hottest thing in the French court. And he had killed his wife and her lover, and he found them in so he was a wild man and, notorious. He was most choice courtier, exquisitely skilled in love toys, apparently, pleasant conceits and court dalliances. She called her ape. She loved being with him. He brought with him some special potions that she was indulging in. He brought her love potion medicine that just made her look so youthful. She was so happy. She was getting high. There's probably laudanum and alcohol, and who knew what other herbs might have been in there. But the Queen was getting off on these two French guys and getting high in the back in her chamber. According to one historian, she became more beautiful and bonny than she'd been for 15 years. Okay, so this is going on. This is she's still possibly going to be able to have a kid, and so these negotiations are quite intense. The Earl of Leicester and Christopher, they tried to have Alençon assassinated twice. They made attempts on his life, but he escaped. And so it was really like a soap opera going on there. And it was Simier who told her that the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, her paramour, had married Lettice Knowley, her cousin, and then she banished Leicester. And, it was just back and forth because it was really, you could make a great soap opera today. I wish somebody would write it, But she was never closer to marrying anyone but Alençon. He was the only one that ever came to England to court her among the many suitors that wrote and sent portraits and money and everything. And when she called off the match, she held on to him for another 3 months just to detain him. Then she dispatched him to the Low Countries to be her agent, leading the army against the Spanish in the Low Countries. Okay, so this is the Dutch Protestants fighting the Spanish during what would be, a very, very long war on and off. And so the guys that tried to kill him actually had to take him to the Low Countries, where he became the Duke of Brabant. But regrettably, the Queen suffered terribly. She published this poem. It's the most ambivalent poem on Monsieur's departure. Oh, he was called Monsieur. That's how he was known at court. Get there. She says, I grieve and dare not show my discontent. I love and yet am forced to seem to hate. I do yet dare not say I ever meant. I seem stark mute, but inwardly do prate. I am and not, I freeze and yet burn, and so on and so on. The most ambivalent passion poem imaginable. And she writes this long poem about, so he was very important to her. This is a satiric image of him. He's holding the tail of the Dutch cow. Queen is feeding the cow. That's the Prince of Orange with her, who's her ally. And there's the King of France, Philip, sitting on top of that, and oppressing the cow. Go look what the cow's doing. The cow's pooping on the Duke of Alençon, So it's a mocking commentary in art about the ineffectuality of this little French Duke that could do nothing to help the Dutch. In fact, he tried to overwhelm Antwerp himself. He got kicked out, went back to France, and died a few months later at the age of 29. So she wore black for 3 weeks. She grieved publicly. Then at the age of 29, Martin Hume says, his passing bell rang down the curtain upon the longest, most eventful comedy in the history of England. Comedy. Stephen Bianski, writing a couple decades ago, says, their courtship became simply a farce, a bit of political theater that dragged on 3 scenes too long, a joke even to the Queen, as she admitted in moments of privacy and candor. So this was going on at court. Okay. This is the 1570s. Shakespeare is 15 years old, still in Stratford, going to knock up Anne Hathaway in a few years. But, how does he know about all this stuff? Let me say, this is an insider deal. The people who were at the court, who knew the people at the court, can relate the story and create something around this that has dramatic representation. Again, the allegorical lockpicking was a courtly pastime, a mind to a disease. Now, if you're writing this play for a noble wedding, and the audience is this narrow group of people that understand how really funny this play is, mocking the Queen and her little Frenchman, you could really have a good time watching this play. It would be wonderful. Now, who else is writing allegories about Elizabeth and Alençon? Well, Edmund Spenser's Mother Hubbard's Tale of the Ape and the Fox is a clear allegory attack on the influence of Simier on the court. And he lost privileges because of that. He was never given what he really deserved in terms of support by the court. And part of it was their objection to him writing a satire about the Queen being influenced by this little ape. The fox was William Cecil. Philip Sidney wrote about the Fortress of Perfect Beauty, and it basically implication that you can't touch this woman. It's all about how high and above you all are that you can't do this. So it was a big production that was put on that Philip Sidney wrote the text for, and which was performed like a pageant. John Lilly's Sappho and Phao, 1584, something about this, right when the negotiations broke down, he went back over, this play came out, and it's about the love between this beautiful, queenly person and this modest person, and it appears to be that. But really, the most important one is Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Here's an image of Angus Bomer as Peter Quince from a 1950s production from one of their circulars. Love that stuff. So who are the allegorical characters in this? Well, Queen Elizabeth is represented by Titania. Titania says, I'm not going to go into that. You'll have to read my paper to really know about that. But Hercule de Valois is Bottom, of course, Francois Hercule de Valois. Now, Bottom says at the very beginning in scene 1, the first scene, of them, I could play Heracles really, or a part to Candid. He's saying he could play Hercules. He's announcing who he's going to play. Okay. Francois is his other first name. So he's Hercules, he's also Francois. So Francis Flute and Thisbe are probably also representations of Alençon. The ambassador de Canzin was Peter Quince, same rooted name. He came over as the first flight of ambassadors to negotiate the marriage between Alençon and Elizabeth. And there were 400 French ambassadors that would come for some of these festivities. These were magnificent courtly negotiations that went on. They were amazing. Dubex was his secretary, was Alençon's secretary. And in French, that means beak. So maybe snout is based on his name. And then Robin Starveling, well, the Earl of Leicester was Queen Elizabeth's Robin. And the name like Starveling means he's out when Alençon and Simier are in. So he's starving for affection from her. And he gets to play Moonshine, which is, of course, appropriate for the Queen. And Ambassador Maud de Pellion is Maud, the fairy Maud. He was also one of the ambassadors. So the whole rude mechanicals are populated by people that come from Alençon's entourage. Now, Bottom repeatedly addresses the fairy, saying, Monsieur, says 10 times in 13 lines, Monsieur, get me the honey bag. Monsieur, do this for me. Scratch me here, Monsieur. Monsieur is what Alençon was called at the court. So why is he saying Monsieur to all these people? It's kind of a crazy thing. And he wants the honey bag. Well, the honey bag is actually the money bag, because the Queen gave him, over these long negotiations and his military campaigns, 350,000 pounds in support for his wartime efforts against the Spaniards. It was a massive, it's like what we give Ukraine, okay? It was like really proxy war with Alençon leading the troops. He wasn't very good at that. But it was an amazing amount of money. Kept on asking for. And then Bottom says, well, Bully Bottom will miss us 6 pence a day. He wanted 60,000 a year. Say Bully Bottom, he doesn't show up. He's going to miss us 6 pence. Is for this. Finally, we're almost there. Oh, we're going over. Are we okay? Can we go a couple more minutes? Thank you. I just got 2 more slides, and thank you for putting up, massive amount of argument. Bottom says, when he's talking about what kind of costume he's going to put on when he's going to play Pyramus, I will discharge it in either your straw-colored beard, your orange tawny beard, your purple and grain beard, or your French crown-colored beard, your perfect yellow. Okay, does that mean cowardly? I don't know. Quinn says, some of your French crowns have no hair at all. Then you play bareface. Now, what does he mean by that little exchange? Well, French crown is a pun. It's a joke about the French prince. He's a crown prince. Okay, so and also the French crown is known as the eruption of the secondary syphilis would cause a skin eruption around the scalp line. So that was called the French crown. So it was a manifestation of secondary syphilis. So it was called the French crown. And Alençon was alleged to have been poxed. Okay, that he had syphilis, and that's why this reference of him who got Stubbs' hand cut off had to do with him accusing him of having the French pox. Okay, so you have puns on French royalty, French money, and the baldness and the eruptions that you get with the French pox. So this is a triple layer illusion that just you miss it if you don't think about this as being relevant to what Shakespeare, the author, whoever he is creating for this wonderful mocking comedy. Okay, almost done. Francis Flute, in describing why he doesn't want to play Thisbe, hey, let me not play a woman. I have a beard to comment. Well, Alençon's beardlessness in the early part of the negotiation was a problem because he was pockmarked. Like Elizabeth, he had smallpox when he was young, but he was left with scarification. Elizabeth, her complexion cleared. She never had long-term skin damage that we could tell. Of course, these are all idealized portraits of her. But but Alençon was left pockmarked. And so to grow a beard meant to cover up these imperfections. So Catherine de' Medici wrote about Alençon to the court saying, his mother, oh, he beginneth to have a beard which come forth, which helps much his imperfections. So the sweet-faced man has had many imperfections. Finally, the last comment I'm going to give you on this one, and this nails it. When Oberon's talk about what he's going to do with this love potion from the purple flower that they've extracted this essence from Cupid's arrow, he says, I'll wash Titania when she is asleep and drop a liquor in her eyes. The next thing she awakening looks upon, be it a lion, bear, wolf, bull, a meddling monkey, or a busy ape, she shall pursue it with the soul of love. So he's saying here, the meddling monkey and the busy ape, he doubles down on this one. Why is he doubling down on the simians? Okay, well, we know that the ape was Simier, called him, and Alençon himself was referred to as the imp of France, and also as a monkey, a little monkey, Petit Magot. So both of these guys had nicknames that referred to them as being monkeys. So I think, we talk about love potion, and Simier had this 15 years younger. What a gas this must have been for people who knew the inside story when it was first being performed. So Professor Roger Strittmatter, whose article really put me online to looking into things and finding Marion Taylor's book here in the Bailey collection, made all the difference in the world of sorting this out and realizing Midsummer Night's Dream is a far more interesting comedy. It's what he calls a closely built comic commentary on one of the most explosive issues of the reign, the intersection of the private life courtships of Elizabeth, a sly commentary on the sexual politics of the Elizabethan era. So there you have it, 3 pieces of things I've pursued here in the Bailey Club, 3 different avenues of exploration that have to do with sources, whether they're political allegorical or literary untranslated sources or rare medical texts, whatever they are. It shows to me that Shakespeare was an amazingly free-spirited person
that got away with writing things that nobody else could write at that time. I mean, he was never arrested following, the production of Richard II on the eve of the Essex Rebellion, when other members of the company were called before a panel and interrogated. Why did you put this play on and stir up that crowd and make it all go south for a little while? But it did go south eventually. So summarizing what I wanted to share with you is that really we had here a century of neglect of most important, interesting idea that Shakespeare was actually influenced by the court dramatists, by the Athenian dramatists writing 2,000 years earlier, that he was reinventing the Greek form. And in many of the plays, there are so many parallels to the Greek structural or metaphoric or the tropes that are used that shows his knowledge and understanding and appreciation for those Greek sources, whether they're in the Latin translation or in the original Greek, I can't tell you. But they were available in the great libraries that the Earl of Oxford, for instance, grew up in. His mentor, Thomas Smith, was the most foremost Greek scholar at Cambridge, a Greek scholar, and produced the plays of Aristophanes in Greek in the years before the Earl of Oxford was influenced by him. Earl of Oxford's uncle translated Ovid's Metamorphoses, probably the most important of all the classical sources. And he translated it while they were both in residence in William Cecil's household. William Cecil's proteges, the wards that were under him, he was Elizabeth's #1 advisor for 45 years. He died in the late 1590s, and she outlived him by about 5 years, and his son Robert, of course, took over. But he had an amazing coterie of people around him, and his home was really the hotspot in London. And he had all these wards that came through, including the Earl of Essex and the Earl of Southampton, to whom Shakespeare dedicated the Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, and probably the Fair Youth of the Sonnets as well. And the Earl of Oxford was his first ward. He made a fortune off of these noblemen whose fathers died before the son's 21st birthday. It was a curse to have your father die when you were young, because you would lose your fortune and have to marry the person that was your protector and held your wardship. So then there's the medical knowledge content that I think is quite remarkable. Cecil had these medical books in his library. Thomas Smith was an alchemist in his own right. So people around the Earl of Oxford, his wives, were both interested in this thing, in medicine. He had 5 medical books dedicated to him during his lifetime alone. So he was involved in promoting the latest thinking in medicine. So, and he had like about 30 works dedicated to him during his lifetime, including classical sources like the Heliodorus Ethiopica, the source of many of the romances. Stephen Gossa, one of the great theater critics of the 1580s, he was a convert from being a playwright to becoming a minister. Okay, so he said that terrible, but Merchant of Venice is pretty good, and Ptolemy, which is probably another title for Antony and Cleopatra, was pretty good. So he actually praised probably Shakespeare's plays. And then I've tried to make an argument here that it's interesting to think about Shakespeare satirizing court people, and that it happens in other plays. In Hamlet, for instance, Polonius is oftentimes thought to have been the model for, standing in for William Cecil, primarily because of certain precepts. William Cecil's son Thomas ran off to Paris and was living a kind of a decadent life over there, gambling and all. And Cecil was infuriated, like Laertes. Okay, he was like a Laertes. So when he came back, he didn't approve of what his son had been doing over there. When the younger son was getting ready to go to Europe and have he wrote these precepts, okay? There's a copy of the precepts here. They were not published in Shakespeare's lifetime, but those precepts are the same, almost paraphrases of what Polonius tells Laertes before he goes off Paris and pursues his studies in Act 1 of Hamlet. So the associations that I see are very intriguing, and I think it's a mystery. I can't tell you who wrote these works, but I can sure tell you that he was informed brilliantly on a variety of fields, and that there's been neglect of the Greek sources in Shakespeare that I think is governed by the limitations of what was available to a commoner growing up in Stratford and attending the grammar school there, which probably did not have a Greek curriculum. And that we don't have any books in his inventory or in his will that we know of. The Shakespeare biographers would say that we've lost the inventory. Well, we don't know there ever was one, but there's no reference to anything that includes a literary life. They didn't have a desk or books or other manuscripts, maps, instruments, anything else that you would expect a writer like Shakespeare to have had. So my pursuit of this, I take pleasure in finding these little nuggets of gold out there that raise the question and enhance the mystery. It really enhances the mystery. I'm going to recite one last passage for you. It's not from Shakespeare. It's not from me. It's from Mary Oliver. And it's a poem that somebody posted online earlier this year, and I just love. And it tells you exactly how I feel about this. The title of the poem is Mysteries. Yes. Truly, we live in mysteries too marvelous to be understood. How grass can be nourishing in the mouths of lambs. How rivers and stones are forever in allegiance with gravity, while we ourselves dream of rising. How two hands touch and the bonds will never be broken. How people come together from delight or from the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. Let me keep my distance all from those who think they have the answer. Let me keep company always from those who say, look, and laugh in astonishment and bow their head. I'll bow my head. Thank you.